medical chart was yellow with age. Brittle. The kind of paper that crumbles if you hold it wrong. December 22nd, 1944. Patient name, Brandt Elise. Status enemy, prisoner of war. Weight on arrival, 98 pounds. 6 months later, that same chart would read 127 pounds. 29 pounds gained, 29 pounds of evidence that everything she'd been taught was a lie. Her name was Elise Brandt. Born 1918 in Frankfurt, Germany, graduated Frankfurt Medical School in 1941 at age 23. Surgical nurse. 3 years of service in Wehrmacht field hospitals from Poland to France to Belgium, and on December 19, 1944, in a freezing barn outside Bastogne, she was about to become a prisoner of the enemy she'd been taught to fear more than death itself. But before we get to that barn, before we get to the moment American soldiers burst through those doors with rifles raised, we need to understand what Elise believed, what she'd been taught, what had been burned into her mind in a dark auditorium in Berlin 18 months earlier. Because the propaganda wasn't subtle, it was detailed, specific, convincing, and Elise Brandt believed every single word. Berlin, June 1943. The auditorium was packed. 300 medical personnel crammed into wooden seats that creaked under weight. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, everyone who wore a white coat or carried surgical instruments for the Wehrmacht. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and nervous sweat. Mandatory training, the notice had said. Enemy medical procedures and prisoner protocol. Attendance required. Elise sat in the 4th row, notebook open, pencil ready. She was 25 years old. She'd been a surgical nurse for 2 years. She'd worked field hospitals in Poland and France. She'd assisted in hundreds of surgeries. She'd held the hands of dying boys as they bled out on tables that were never clean enough, never sterile enough. She thought she'd seen everything war had to offer. She was wrong. The lecturer was an SS officer, not a doctor. That should have been her first clue, but hindsight is a luxury Elise wouldn't have for another 18 months. He stood at the podium with a pointer and a slide projector. Tall, severe. The kind of man whose uniform was always pressed, whose boots always shined, whose voice never wavered. The Americans and British. He began, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. Claim to follow medical ethics. They claim to honor the Geneva Convention regarding treatment of captured medical personnel. Click. The first slide appeared on the screen behind him. Elise's stomach dropped. The photograph showed a surgical table, a body. Instruments arranged with deliberate cruelty. The image was grainy, obviously staged, but effective, terrifyingly effective. This, the lecturer continued, his pointer tapping the screen, is what happens in American field hospitals when German prisoners are brought in for examination. Another click. Another image. This one showed a woman's face twisted in pain, strapped to a table. Whether it was real or fabricated, Elise couldn't tell. It looked real enough. They conduct experiments, the SS officer said. His voice was matter-of-fact, clinical, like he was describing a routine procedure. They test new surgical techniques on enemy prisoners before using them on their own soldiers. They study pain tolerance, response to trauma, limits of human endurance. Elise wrote this down. Her hand was steady. Everyone wrote it down because questioning wasn't allowed, and because the photographs looked convincing, and because when an SS officer tells you something in a room full of witnesses, you nod and you write, and you don't ask questions. Click. Another slide. This one showed instruments. Scalpels, forceps, clamps, arranged on a tray next to what appeared to be restraints. If you are captured, the lecturer said, and his voice dropped to something almost kind, almost paternal. You must understand what awaits you. The Americans will pretend to examine you. They will claim they are providing medical care, but it is a facade. He paused. Let that word hang in the air. Facade. What they are actually doing is gathering intelligence. They will document every injury, every weakness. They will probe for information about our medical capabilities, our supplies, our procedures. They will ask questions disguised as routine medical inquiries, and they will not be gentle about it. The next series of slides showed what was supposedly evidence of these examination techniques: women with bruises, burns, faces contorted in agony. Elise couldn't tell if the images were authentic or fabricated. 18 months later, she would realize they were almost certainly staged. But in June 1943, sitting in that auditorium surrounded by 300 other medical professionals who were all seeing the same images, all writing the same notes, all breathing the same air, thick with cigarette smoke and fear, the photographs looked real enough. Female medical personnel, the lecturer continued, face additional risks. The Americans have shown particular interest in German women, in understanding our breeding programs, our racial health initiatives. This was a lie, a complete fabrication. But Elise didn't know that in 1943. A woman in the front row raised her hand. Brave or foolish, Elise couldn't decide which. "What if they force us?" the woman asked. Her voice was small, scared. "What if we have no choice?" The SS officer smiled. It was not a comforting expression. "Then you endure it," he said simply. "You survive it. And you remember every detail so that you can report it when you are repatriated through Red Cross exchanges." He clicked to the final slide. The photograph showed a woman sitting in a chair, staring at nothing, eyes hollow, empty, the kind of emptiness that comes from trauma so deep it breaks something fundamental in the human spirit. This woman, the lecturer said, his pointer resting on her image, was returned to us after 6 months in American custody. Note the psychological damage. She can no longer practice medicine. The trauma of what they did to her during so-called routine examinations left her unable to function. Elise stared at that photograph for a long time, at those hollow eyes, that empty expression. She memorized that face because the lecturer told them to. Because remembering was important. Because if she was ever captured, she needed to know what she was facing. That woman, she decided, would not be her. If captured, she would endure whatever came. She would survive. She would return. She would report on American brutality so that other German medical personnel would be warned, would be prepared, would know what monsters they faced. It never occurred to her that the entire lecture was a lie, that the photographs were staged, that the woman with the hollow eyes was probably an actress or a mental patient whose image had been appropriated for propaganda purposes. It never occurred to Elise that she was being manipulated, programmed, prepared to believe something so thoroughly that when the truth finally confronted her, it would shatter everything she thought she knew about the world. The lecture ended. 300 medical personnel filed out of that auditorium. 300 notebooks filled with lies. 300 minds poisoned with fear, disguised as information. Elise walked out into Berlin sunlight. It was June, warm. The city still mostly intact, still functioning, still months away from the bombing campaigns that would reduce it to rubble. She walked back to her quarters. She filed her notes carefully. She reviewed them that night before sleep. And she believed completely. 1 month later, Poland, July 1943. The field hospital was a converted warehouse on the outskirts of a town whose name Elise never learned. The Wehrmacht had swept through, taken what they needed, left the wounded behind. The warehouse had been a textile factory once. Now it was rows of cots, surgical tables, the smell of blood and disinfectant and gangrene. Elise had been there for 3 weeks, long enough to know the rhythms, long enough to recognize the sounds. Artillery fire meant incoming wounded. Silence meant everyone was either dead or dug in too deep to move. The in-between sounds, small arms fire, sporadic mortar rounds, those meant business as usual. The prisoner arrived on a Tuesday. Soviet soldier, early 20s, gut wound, shrapnel from what looked like a grenade. He'd been brought in with a group of German wounded, dumped on a cot in the corner, left to wait, while the surgical teams dealt with their own. Elise was restocking supplies when she heard him. A low moan. Continuous. The kind of sound that comes from pain so constant the body can't even scream anymore.
Just this low animal keen that doesn't stop, doesn't vary, just goes on like a machine stuck in the same gear. She walked over, looked down at him. Young, maybe 22, 23. Dark hair, matted with sweat. Face grey. The kind of grey that meant shock blood loss, the body starting to shut down. His hands were pressed against his abdomen. Blood seeped between his fingers. Not spurting. That would have been better. Spurting meant an artery, which meant death would come quick.
This was a slow bleed, the kind that takes hours. Elise checked his pupils, responsive, checked his pulse, thready but present. The wound was bad but survivable, with surgery, with morphine for the pain, with fluids to replace blood loss. She had morphine, 2 vials in her supply kit, standard issue, enough for 2 soldiers, maybe 3 if she diluted it. She started to reach for it. "Brandt!" Her supervisor's voice, loud, cutting across the warehouse. Elise turned. The supervisor was standing by the surgical table where a German soldier, 19 years old, leg, shattered by machine gun fire, was waiting for amputation. The surgeon was scrubbing, preparing. They needed assistance. "We need you here," the supervisor called. "Now." Elise looked down at the Soviet prisoner. He was looking at her, eyes focused, aware, pleading without words because he didn't speak German and she didn't speak Russian. But pain is a universal language, and those eyes were saying, "Please, please, please." She looked at the morphine in her hand. "Brandt!" The supervisor's voice was sharper now, impatient. Elise made a choice, the same choice she would make 40, maybe 50, maybe 60 times over the next year and a half. The choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She put the morphine back in her kit, walked away, assisted with the German soldier's amputation. The surgery took 90 minutes. When she finally returned to the corner where the Soviet prisoner had been, he was still there, still breathing, still making that low, continuous moan. But the morphine stayed in her kit, because there were more German wounded coming in, because supplies were limited, because priorities had to be maintained, because the lecturer in Berlin had been very clear about the natural order of things, about who mattered and who didn't, about practical decisions in wartime. The Soviet prisoner died 9 hours later, slow, painful, aware. Elise told herself it was war, told herself resources were scarce, told herself she'd made the practical choice, the necessary choice, the choice any good German nurse would make. She told herself a lot of things that night. None of them helped her sleep. Over the next 18 months, the pattern repeated. Poland, France, Belgium, different warehouses, different barns, different commandeered buildings turned into temporary hospitals, different wounded, different faces. But always the same choice, German soldiers first, always first. If there was enough morphine left over, enough bandages, enough penicillin, enough time, then maybe the prisoners would receive treatment. Maybe, usually there wasn't enough. Elise stopped counting after the first 20. It was easier that way. Easier to focus on the German boys she saved than the enemy soldiers she let die. Easier to believe the propaganda that said this was necessary, practical, the way war had to be fought. By December 1944, she'd become very good at not feeling, at seeing bodies as problems to solve rather than people with mothers and sisters and homes they'd never see again, at disconnecting, at functioning. It was the only way to survive, or so she told herself. The field hospital outside Bastogne was a converted barn. Old stone walls, wooden rafters, drafty, the kind of cold that settled into your bones and didn't leave. December in Belgium was brutal, not the clean, crisp cold of winter in Germany. This was damp, penetrating, the kind of cold that made blood congeal faster on the surgical tables, which was actually helpful when you were working with limited supplies and no proper heating. Elise had been there for 6 days. The Battle of Bastogne had been raging for a week. The Americans had the town surrounded. The Wehrmacht was trying to break through. Neither side was winning. Both sides were bleeding. The barn had become a processing center for the wounded. They came in waves. After each assault, each counterattack, each artillery barrage, boys with missing limbs, boys with chest wounds, boys with faces half gone, boys who would die no matter what Elise did, and boys who might live if she worked fast enough. She'd learned to triage by sound. The ones screaming were usually salvageable. The quiet ones were either in shock or too far gone. You worked on the screamers first. December 19th, 1944, 3 in the afternoon. Elise was in the middle of amputating a soldier's frostbitten foot. The boy was 19. Both feet had been frozen solid. The left foot was already gone. She was working on the right. The surgeon was at another table. Elise was doing this one herself. She'd done enough amputations by now, knew where to cut, how to tie off arteries, how to minimize blood loss. The boy was screaming. That was good, meant he was conscious, meant the morphine was working just enough to dull the pain without knocking him out completely. You wanted them conscious during amputation, made it easier to monitor for shock. Then the shells started falling. American artillery. The sound was distinct, different from German ordnance, a deeper boom, a faster rate of fire. The Americans had artillery that didn't quit. That just kept coming in waves until there was nothing left to shoot at. The barn shook. Dust rained from the rafters, ancient dust, the kind that had been sitting undisturbed for 100 years until American shells knocked it loose. The soldier on Elise's table screamed louder, not from pain, from fear. Because artillery meant the Americans were close, meant the line was breaking, meant the war they'd been fighting for 3 years was finally, obviously, inevitably coming to an end. "Finish the procedure," the supervisor's voice barked from across the barn, sharp, commanding, like nothing was wrong, like the world wasn't shaking apart around them. Elise's hands didn't stop. Muscle memory. 3 years of cutting and stitching and tying off arteries. She could do this in her sleep, could do it while the world ended. Another shell hit, closer, close enough that Elise felt it in her teeth. The lights went out. The barn had been running on a generator. Old, failing. The shell must have been close enough to kill it. In the darkness, someone was crying. Someone else was praying. In French. A prisoner they'd been treating, a French resistance fighter with a bullet wound in the shoulder. He'd been waiting for surgery. Now he was praying. Rapid French. Words Elise didn't understand, but tone she recognized. The sound of someone who knows they're about to die. Elise's hands, covered in blood, fumbled for her instruments in the darkness. Found the scalpel, found the clamps. Kept working by touch. By memory. By the desperate need to finish this one thing. This one amputation. Before everything fell apart, the lights came back on, the generator coughing back to life, sputtering, uncertain. The barn doors burst open. American soldiers poured in, rifles raised, helmets dark against the winter light. Voices shouting in English, words Elise didn't understand, but meaning that was perfectly clear. "Hands up! Hände hoch, schnell!" The German was broken, heavily accented, but the rifles were fluent. Elise raised her hands. They were still holding the scalpel, still dripping with blood. Her patient's blood. The boy with the half-amputated foot was staring at her, eyes wide, terrified. Not of the Americans. Of her, afraid she would leave him like this, unfinished, bleeding. An American soldier, young, maybe 20, pointed his rifle directly at Elise's chest. For a moment, they stared at each other. 2 people on opposite sides of a war neither of them had started. 2 people trying to stay alive in a barn that smelled like blood and gangrene and fear. "Nurse," Elise said in English, the only English word she knew that mattered right now. "I am nurse, Krankenschwester." The American soldier lowered his rifle, slightly, not all the way, but enough. Another soldier, older maybe 30, moved past Elise to the table where her patient lay, the boy with the half-amputated foot, the boy who was still bleeding, still in shock, still German, still the enemy. "Medic," the older soldier called. "We got wounded here." An American medic appeared, helmet marked with a red cross. He looked at Elise's patient, looked at the half-finished amputation, looked at Elise. Then he knelt down beside the table and started working, checking vitals, administering morphine, finishing what Elise had started. Elise stood there, hands still raised, scalpel still dripping, watching an American medic treat a German soldier, an enemy. With the same professional focus, the same careful attention, the same determination to save a life that Elise herself had been taught to reserve only for her own people. It didn't make sense. The Americans were supposed to be savages, supposed to torture prisoners, supposed to use medical examinations as covers for interrogation and experimentation and cruelty. But this medic was just working, just doing his job, just trying to save a boy who would have died if left alone. Elise's worldview, built on 3 years of propaganda and 18 months of lies, started to crack. She didn't know it yet, wouldn't know it for another 3 days. But that crack, small and barely visible, would grow, would spread, would eventually shatter everything she believed. "You," the older American soldier said to Elise, "come with me." They were herded out, 18 medical personnel, 12 German soldiers, 2 wounded, to walk. The Americans separated them immediately, medical staff to the left, combatants to the right. Elise never saw the wounded German soldiers again, never knew if they lived or died, never knew if the American medic who'd finished her amputation managed to save that boy with the frostbitten feet. She stood in the left group, hands still bloody, mind still reeling, trying to understand what she'd just witnessed. The Americans loaded them into trucks, canvas-covered, cold, cramped, 18 German medical personnel packed like cargo. The trucks started moving, away from Bastogne, away from the front lines, away from everything Elise had known for 3 years. One of the other nurses started crying, quietly, not from pain, from fear, because they all knew what was supposed to happen next. The lecture, the photographs, the warnings. They were prisoners now, enemy prisoners, and according to everything they'd been taught, what came next would be worse than death. Elise sat in the truck, hands still bloody, mind still cycling through what she'd just seen. The American medic, the German soldier, the careful professional treatment. It didn't fit, didn't match the narrative, didn't align with the photographs from Berlin or the warnings from the SS officer or the certainty that had carried Elise through 3 years of war. The truck hit a pothole. Everyone lurched. Someone whimpered. The journey had just begun. 3 days to the processing facility. 3 days of cold and fear and uncertainty. 3 days that would change everything. But Elise didn't know that yet. All she knew was that her hands were bloody and her patient was gone, and the Americans, who were supposed to be monsters, had just saved a German boy's life. The truck rolled on, into the winter dark, into the unknown, into a truth that Elise Brandt wasn't ready to face. Not yet, but soon. The first meal came 6 hours into the journey. The trucks had stopped. Middle of nowhere. Belgian countryside, frozen solid under December sky. The canvas flaps opened and American soldiers appeared with metal containers, steam rising in the cold air. Elise expected nothing, or maybe scraps, leftovers. The kind of food you give to livestock. That's what prisoners received in Wehrmacht camps. Thin soup, stale bread, just enough to keep them alive for labor or interrogation. What she got instead was a tin bowl filled with vegetable soup, real vegetable soup, with carrots, potatoes, and chunks of something that looked impossible. Meat. Elise stared at the bowl, the steam rising, the smell hitting her nose. Beef, actual beef. She hadn't seen real meat in 4 months. The Wehrmacht had been running on ersatz, everything, by late 1944. Ersatz coffee, ersatz bread. Meat was something officers got, not field hospital nurses. She lifted the spoon. The liquid was hot, almost too hot. She blew on it, brought it to her lips. The taste hit her like a shell blast. Salt. Real salt, not the recycled chemical substitute they'd been using. Then the savory richness of actual beef stock. The potato dissolved on her tongue. Soft. Properly cooked. The carrots still had texture. The meat required chewing. Real protein. Real fat. Real food. Elise swallowed. The warmth traveled down her throat. Into her stomach. A stomach that had been running on turnip soup and black bread for months. A stomach that had forgotten what real food felt like. Around her, the other nurses ate in silence. Like speaking might make the food disappear. Like this was a dream that would evaporate if they acknowledged it. But Elise's mind was elsewhere, flashing back to a propaganda film she'd seen in early 1944. American streets, bread lines, the narrator's voice confident and certain. The Americans are starving. Their economy has collapsed. They must import everything from the British. They are a weak nation, sustained only by foreign aid. And Elise looked at the soup in her bowl, at the chunks of beef, at the vegetables that hadn't come from a can or a jar, but had been fresh, once recently fresh enough to still have flavor. Her hand was shaking. The spoon rattled against the tin. This wasn't the food of a starving nation. This was abundance. Casual abundance, the kind of abundance that could afford to feed enemy prisoners better than its own people fed their citizens. Greta, the nurse sitting beside her, whispered, "Why are they feeding us so well?" Someone across the truck muttered, "Fattening us up, like livestock before slaughter." Elise didn't respond, couldn't respond. Her mouth was full of evidence that contradicted everything she'd been taught, and she didn't know which was worse, the possibility that the Americans were planning something terrible, or the possibility that the propaganda had been lying all along. She finished the soup, every drop, because she was hungry, and because it was there, and because some part of her, the part that had survived 3 years of war, knew that you ate when food appeared. You didn't ask questions, you didn't wonder. You ate. But the questions stayed, growing, like a crack in ice spreading across a frozen lake. Day 2, morning, the trucks had stopped again, this time for longer. The canvas flaps opened, and American soldiers distributed breakfast. Bread. Not the dense, dark military bread Elise knew, not the sawdust mixed rations that the Wehrmacht had been producing since 1943. This bread was soft. When Elise tore off a piece, it gave way easily. The inside was white, airy, the kind of bread that required wheat flour, real wheat, not the mixed grains and fillers that German bakeries had been using. And on top of each slice, spread thick and generous, was butter, real butter. Elise stared at it. She hadn't seen real butter in 2 years, maybe longer. The Wehrmacht used margarine when they had anything at all. Most of the time, bread came plain, dry, something you chewed because you needed calories, not because it provided any pleasure. She lifted the bread to her nose, smelled it, fresh, recently baked. The yeast still active enough to give off that distinct warm scent. Then she bit down. The butter flooded her mouth, creamy, rich. It melted instantly against her tongue, coated her throat. The taste was pure, sweet cream, salt from the bread, that yeasty warmth of properly made dough. The texture was impossibly soft, nothing like the hard rations she'd been eating. This bread required no effort. It almost dissolved, like eating clouds, like eating something that shouldn't exist in wartime. Elise closed her eyes. For 5 seconds, maybe 10, there was no war, no barn, no amputations, no Soviet prisoner dying over 9 hours while she walked away. There was just this, butter and bread, warmth, flavor, the kind of simple, perfect pleasure that human beings had been enjoying for thousands of years before someone invented nations and borders and reasons to kill each other. Then reality crashed back. Her mother's last letter, October 1944. 3 sentences burned into Elise's memory. "We are eating turnip soup 4 days a week. The bread ration has been cut to 200 grams per day. Your father's coat no longer fits. He has lost too much weight. 200 grams, 7 ounces. One small roll. That was what German citizens were receiving. That was what her parents, loyal citizens of the Reich, devoted supporters of the war effort, were surviving on. And here was Elise, enemy prisoner, captured by the savages, eating soft white bread with real butter spread so thick she could see her teeth marks in it. The guilt hit like artillery fire. "I'm eating better as a prisoner," she whispered. The words came out before she could stop them. "Better than my family. Better than German citizens." Greta looked at her. "What? Officers in Berlin don't eat this well," Elise said. Her voice was shaking. "I've seen their mess halls, seen their rations. They get margarine if they're lucky. And we're prisoners. We're supposed to be starving. We're supposed to be tortured. And instead they're giving us butter." Greta's face was pale. "It's a trick. It has to be. They're making us soft before the real treatment begins." But Elise wasn't sure anymore. Because the bread in her hand was real, the butter coating her throat was real, and the propaganda that said Americans were starving, that said they had nothing, that said they were weak and desperate and barely surviving, that propaganda was starting to feel very, very thin. She ate the bread anyway, every crumb, because she was hungry and because it was delicious, and because some part of her, the part that had walked away from dying prisoners 40 times, 60 times, the part that had made practical choices and necessary choices and choices that let her sleep at night, that part was beginning to understand that maybe she'd been practical and necessary about all the wrong things. The crack was spreading. Still small, still manageable, but growing. Day 3, afternoon, the journey was almost over. The trucks had been rolling for hours. The nurses had stopped talking, stopped speculating. They just sat, cold, exhausted, waiting. Then the canvas flaps opened again, but this time it wasn't mealtime. It was just one American soldier. Young, maybe 19, blonde hair, farm boy face, the kind of face that looked like it had never seen combat, never fired a rifle in anger, never watched anyone die. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out something wrapped in brown paper. Chocolate bars. American chocolate, Hershey's. The brown wrapper with white letters. He tossed them into the truck. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bars. Then he was gone. Canvas flaps closed. Truck started moving again. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. The chocolate bars lay on the floor of the truck like unexploded ordnance. Then Greta picked one up, unwrapped it. The sound of tearing paper was loud in the silence. Elise watched. Greta broke off a square, put it in her mouth, her eyes closed. Her face did something complicated, something between pleasure and pain. "It's real," Greta whispered. "It's real chocolate." Elise picked up a bar. The wrapper crinkled in her hand. She hadn't held chocolate since 1942. Real chocolate had disappeared from Germany early in the war. Everything was ersatz. Substitute. Made from who knows what, tasted like brown wax. This was American chocolate, the enemy's chocolate, given freely, tossed into a truck full of prisoners like it was nothing. Like chocolate was so abundant, so common that a 19-year-old farm boy could carry 5 bars in his pocket and give them away without a second thought. Elise unwrapped the bar. The chocolate was dark, smooth. She broke off a piece. Smaller than Greta's, more cautious, like the chocolate might explode. Might be poisoned, might be the trap they'd been waiting for. She put it in her mouth. The sweetness detonated across her tongue, not subtle, not delicate, not just pure, overwhelming sweetness. The chocolate melted immediately, coating her mouth. The flavor was cocoa, real cocoa, rich, slightly bitter underneath the sugar, and milk, cream, the smoothness that only dairy could provide. Tears started, involuntary, not from sadness, not from fear, from the taste, from the shock of flavor after years of nothing, from the way her body responded to real sugar, real fat, real pleasure after so long without. Elise swallowed. The chocolate coated her throat. Warm, sweet, perfect. and wrong. So deeply, fundamentally wrong. Because savages didn't share chocolate, barbarians didn't give prisoners real food, monsters didn't waste resources on enemy captives who were supposedly headed for torture and experimentation and medical horrors. The Americans were supposed to be starving, desperate, barely holding on. That's what the newsreels showed. That's what the officers said. That's what the propaganda repeated so often it became truth insisted was real. But this chocolate was real, this butter was real, this soup with actual beef was real, which meant something else, something Elise had believed for 3 years, something she'd built her entire understanding of this war around, that something was not real, that something was a lie. The truck rolled on. Elise sat with melting chocolate on her tongue and her worldview cracking like ice in spring. The sound was almost audible, the splintering, the breaking, the fundamental shift from certainty to doubt. She wasn't ready, wasn't prepared. The Berlin lecture hadn't covered this. The photographs hadn't warned about kindness, about abundance, about enemy soldiers who shared chocolate with prisoners like it meant nothing. The SS officer had taught her to expect pain, to endure torture, to survive brutality and report back so others would know what monsters the Americans were. But nobody had taught her how to survive this. How to process bread with butter, how to reconcile propaganda with chocolate melting on her tongue, how to maintain hatred in the face of casual, thoughtless generosity. Greta was crying too now, quietly. The kind of crying that comes from confusion more than sadness. "What are they doing to us?" she whispered. Elise didn't answer, because she didn't know. Because the only answer that made sense, the answer that was forming in the back of her mind, like a storm on the horizon, was too terrifying to speak out loud. They weren't doing anything to them, they were just feeding them, just treating them like human beings, just following whatever protocols or ethics or basic human decency governed how the American military dealt with prisoners of war. And if that was true, if the Americans were simply being humane, then everything else, all the lectures and photographs and warnings and certainties, all of it was a lie. All of it. The chocolate finished melting, the sweetness faded, but the questions remained, growing, spreading, impossible to ignore. The truck rolled on through Belgian countryside, toward whatever came next, toward the processing facility, toward the examination that Elise had been taught to fear more than death, toward the truth that would finish what the chocolate had started. The breaking of Elise Brandt had begun, not with cruelty, not with torture, not with any of the horrors she'd been warned about, but with butter, with bread, with chocolate shared freely by a farm boy who probably didn't think twice about it. Sometimes the most effective weapons aren't weapons at all. Sometimes they're just kindness, just humanity, just the simple act of treating an enemy like a person. And sometimes that kindness, that humanity, that simple act is more devastating than any torture ever could be. Because torture you can resist, torture you can endure. Torture gives you something to fight against, something to hate, something to use as fuel to maintain your certainty that you're right and they're wrong. But kindness destroys certainty. Kindness asks questions.
Kindness forces you to confront the possibility that maybe, just maybe, everything you believed was wrong. The truck stopped. The canvas flaps opened. An American voice. "End of the line. Everybody out." Elise stepped down. Her legs were stiff from 3 days of sitting. The ground was solid beneath her feet. American ground now. Enemy territory. The place where, according to 3 years of propaganda, the real nightmares would begin. She looked up, saw a building, large, brick.
Windows with actual glass. American flags everywhere, a sign in English she couldn't read. This was the processing facility. This was where the examinations would happen, where the truth about American brutality would finally be revealed, or where everything Elise believed would shatter completely. She didn't know which she feared more. The building had been a school once. You could tell from the architecture, high ceilings, long hallways. Rooms designed for 30 students now repurposed for processing prisoners of war. The conversion was recent, paint still fresh on the walls, American efficiency applied to the machinery of war. Elise and the 17 other medical personnel were led inside. Their boots echoed on tile floors, clean tile, swept, mopped, the kind of clean that spoke of order routine systems that functioned even in wartime. Through windows, Elise caught glimpses of the facility, barbed wire fences, guard towers, but also clotheslines, a courtyard, gardens dormant for winter but clearly maintained. This didn't look like a torture facility. It looked like a school converted into a camp. Functional, organized, almost boring in its efficiency. They were separated by gender. The men led left, the women Elise, and 6 others led right. Down another hallway, into a waiting room with wooden benches and windows that actually had curtains. Thin curtains, government issue, but curtains nonetheless. Elise sat. The bench was hard, uncomfortable, but it was a bench, not a floor, not standing room only, actual furniture for prisoners to wait on. The contradictions were piling up, becoming impossible to ignore. The door opened. A woman entered. Not in military uniform. Older, maybe 50. Grey hair pulled back in a practical bun. Wearing a simple dress and cardigan. Glasses perched on her nose. She looked like somebody's aunt, somebody's schoolteacher. Not a soldier, not a guard. She spoke. Perfect German. No accent, native fluency. "My name is Helen Schmidt," she said. Her voice was calm, professional. "I'm a translator for this facility. You're going to be processed according to Geneva Convention standards. That means a medical examination documentation of your identity and assignment to a prisoner of war camp." Someone asked the question they were all thinking. One of the nurses, younger, barely 20. Her voice shook. "What kind of medical examination?" Helen's expression didn't change, didn't become cruel or mocking or sadistic, just remained calm, matter of fact. "Standard physical examination," she said. "Height, weight, blood pressure, screening for infectious diseases, treatment for any injuries or illnesses you may have. It's required by international law for all prisoners of war." The younger nurse started crying. Quiet tears, because she'd sat through the same lecture Elise had, seen the same photographs, been taught the same lies. Helen noticed. Her expression softened slightly. Not pity, something closer to understanding. "You'll be examined by Dr. Miriam Ashford," she continued. "She's the chief medical officer for this facility. She's been a physician for 20 years. You'll be treated one at a time. The examination will take approximately 10 to 15 minutes. Any questions?" No one dared ask. What would be the point if this was the prelude to torture? Questions wouldn't stop it. If it wasn't questions, would reveal how thoroughly they'd been propagandized. Either way, silence was safer. Helen nodded, like she understood the silence, like she'd seen it before from other prisoners who arrived expecting monsters and found bureaucracy instead. "I was born in Hamburg," she said. Unprompted, unnecessary information, but she said it anyway. "My family immigrated to the United States in 1933. I was 15. We saw what was coming, and we left." She didn't elaborate, didn't need to. 1933. The year everything changed in Germany. The year certain families, certain people, started making calculations about whether staying was survivable. Greta found her voice. "You hate us." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. An assumption, because Helen had left, because she'd escaped, because she was here helping the Americans process German prisoners, so obviously she must hate them. Helen considered this. Took her time, like the question deserved a real answer. "I hate what your government did," she said finally. "I hate what it turned Germany into. What it did to people like my family, what it's done to the world." She paused, looked at each of them. 7 German women in stained uniforms who'd spent 3 days in a truck eating bread and chocolate. "But you You're just nurses who got caught in a war you probably didn't want. Hard to hate that. She left. The door closed. The 7 women sat in silence. Elise stared at the floor, at the clean tile, at the absence of blood or torture implements or any of the things the photographs in Berlin had promised. 3 days ago she'd been certain. 3 days ago she'd known exactly what was coming. 3 days ago the world had made sense. Now nothing made sense. And the examination hadn't even started yet. They called Elise third, not first, not last. Random selection, or maybe alphabetical. Brandt would come early in any German list. She stood. Her legs were shaking. 3 years of war. Hundreds of surgeries. Dozens of artillery barrages. She'd held dying boys' hands while they bled out. She'd worked through bombing campaigns. She'd amputated limbs with shells falling close enough to shake the building. But walking down this clean hallway toward a medical examination terrified her more than any of it. Because combat, you could understand. Combat had rules, physics, cause and effect. Artillery falls, people die. Simple, brutal, comprehensible. But this kindness followed by examination, this abundance followed by processing, this violated everything she'd been taught about how enemies behaved, and the violation was more frightening than any shell burst. The hallway smelled of disinfectant, clean, sterile, too clean. The kind of environment that existed in well-supplied hospitals, not makeshift prisoner facilities. The smell reminded Elise of Frankfurt Medical School, of training, of a time before the war when medicine was about healing, not about choosing which nationality deserved morphine. The examination room was small, white walls, one window with those same thin curtains, a medical examination table, paper covering, cabinets filled with supplies, glass bottles, bandages, instruments arranged neatly on trays, an American flag in the corner because apparently even medical rooms needed flags, and standing by the sink, washing her hands with methodical precision, was Dr. Miriam Ashford. She was 44. Elise would learn this later. But right now, all Elise registered was auburn hair going grey, pulled back in a bun. White coat over an army uniform. The posture of someone who'd spent decades in medicine. Shoulders slightly forward from years of leaning over patients. Hands moving with automatic precision through the washing ritual. Soap, water, scrub between fingers. Rinse, dry. Dr. Ashford turned. Her expression was professional, not cold, not warm, just professional. The look of a doctor beginning an examination, the look Elise herself had probably worn thousands of times. "Good morning," Dr. Ashford said in English, then in careful but competent German, "Guten Morgen, please have a seat on the table." Elise's legs moved. Autopilot. Years of following medical instructions. She sat, the paper covering crinkled beneath her. The sound was loud in the quiet room. Dr. Ashford dried her hands, pulled on gloves, thin rubber gloves, standard medical equipment, not restraints, not torture implements, just gloves. She picked up a clipboard, pen ready. Name, Elise Brandt. Age, 26. Position in German Medical Corps. Surgical nurse, 3 years. Dr. Ashford wrote this down. Her handwriting was neat, precise, the kind of handwriting that came from years of writing medical charts where clarity could mean the difference between life and death. She set the clipboard aside, looked directly at Elise. Eye contact, not aggressive, not invasive, just direct. The way doctors look at patients. "I'm going to conduct a physical examination," she said. Her German was accented but clear. "I'll explain everything before I do it. If you're uncomfortable at any point, tell me. You can refuse any part of this examination. Do you understand?" Elise nodded, couldn't speak. Her throat was closed. This was wrong. All wrong. The doctor was supposed to be cruel. Supposed to enjoy this. Supposed to use the examination as a cover for something darker. But Dr. Ashford just looked tired. Professional. Like she'd done this 100 times before and would do it 100 times more, and it was just part of the job. "I need verbal confirmation," Dr. Ashford said, gentle but firm. "Do you understand that you can refuse any part of this examination?" "Yes." The word came out as a whisper. "Good. Let's begin." Dr. Ashford started with the basics. Blood pressure cuff on Elise's arm, the squeeze, the release, the familiar sensation of pressure, then relief. Elise had done this procedure herself hundreds of times. On German soldiers, on officers, on prisoners when there was time. "Your blood pressure is low," Dr. Ashford noted. Her voice was clinical, observational. "Not dangerously so, but it indicates malnutrition. Have you been eating regularly?" "When there was food." "I see." She wrote something on the chart. "We'll address that." Thermometer under Elise's tongue. The glass was smooth. Cold. Elise sat still while Dr. Ashford counted seconds watching a pocket watch. Old-fashioned, the kind real doctors carried. Real doctors. The kind that had been in medicine for generations. "Normal temperature," Dr. Ashford said, removing the thermometer. "No fever. That's good." Stethoscope next. The metal was cold against Elise's chest, then her back, through the thin fabric of her uniform. "Breathe in deep as you can. Good. Now out. Again. In, out." Elise breathed. The stethoscope moved. Dr. Ashford's face was concentrated, listening, evaluating. "Your lungs sound clear," she said. "No signs of pneumonia or fluid buildup. Considering the conditions you've been living in, that's fortunate." Light in Elise's eyes, bright, sharp, the kind of light that makes you blink involuntarily. "Look at me. Now left, now right. Follow my finger." Elise's eyes tracked the movement, back and forth, up and down. "Pupils responding normally," Dr. Ashford said. "No signs of head trauma or neurological damage." She stepped back, set down the pen light. "Set. I'm going to examine your hands and arms now. May I? Permission?" Asking, like Elise had a choice, like this wasn't happening to her, but with her cooperation. Elise extended her hands. They were shaking. 3 years of surgery and they'd never shaken like this. But now, in this clean room with this professional doctor who was asking permission, they trembled like leaves in wind. Dr. Ashford took them gently. Her gloved hands were warm, steady. She turned Elise's hands over, examining the palms, the fingers, the calluses that came from holding scalpels, retractors, surgical instruments for hours at a time. "These calluses are from surgical work," Dr. Ashford said. It wasn't a question, but Elise answered anyway. "Yes." "How long have you been a surgical nurse?" 3 years, since 1941. Dr. Ashford nodded, still holding Elise's hands, still examining. Her touch was clinical but not rough, professional but not cruel. "I see evidence of frostbite on 3 fingers," she said. "Old injury. Several months old. You should regain full feeling eventually, but keep them warm in cold weather. The nerve damage is permanent but minimal." She released Elise's hands, stepped back. "Any injuries I should know about? Any pain anywhere?" Elise hesitated. There was pain, constant pain in her lower back from standing during long surgeries, chronic headaches from stress and malnutrition, joint pain in her knees from standing on concrete floors for hours, but admitting weakness felt dangerous, felt like providing ammunition, felt like giving the enemy information they could use. Dr. Ashford seemed to sense the hesitation. Her expression shifted, not to frustration, to something closer to understanding. "I'm not interrogating you," she said quietly. "I'm trying to help. If you're hurt, if you're in pain, I need to know so I can treat it. That's all this is. Treatment, not interrogation." Something in her voice. The exhaustion, maybe. The genuine frustration at the idea that medicine would be confused with torture. It sounded real, felt real. "My back," Elise admitted. Her voice was barely audible. "It hurts, constantly, from standing during surgeries." How long? 6 months, maybe longer. Dr. Ashford nodded, like this was expected, like she'd heard it before. I'll note that in your chart. We'll get you some pain medication. Our supplies are limited, but we have enough for basic pain management. It won't eliminate the pain completely, but it should help. She continued the examination, checking Elise's teeth. Some gum disease, likely from vitamin deficiency. Her hair, brittle, sign of protein deficiency but not severe. Her reflexes, her spine, her joints. Each step explained before execution. Each touch professional, clinical. Exactly what a medical examination should be. At no point was there pain. At no point was there anything that resembled the torture Elise had been taught to expect. At no point did Dr. Ashford do anything that wasn't standard medical procedure. Finally, she stepped back, removed her gloves, threw them in a waste bin, washed her hands again, the same methodical process. Soap, water, scrub, rinse, dry. You're malnourished and exhausted, Dr. Ashford said, turning back to face Elise. But otherwise healthy, no signs of infectious disease, no major injuries that require immediate intervention. I'm going to prescribe vitamin supplements and recommend increased caloric intake. You'll be assigned to a camp with medical facilities where you can receive ongoing care if needed. She picked up the clipboard, wrote something. Her handwriting was still neat, still precise. You're free to go, she said. Helen will take you back to the waiting area. Elise sat on the examination table, frozen, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened, or rather, what hadn't happened. Dr. Ashford looked up from her clipboard. Is something wrong? I don't understand. The words came out before Elise could stop them. What don't you understand? Why aren't you? Elise couldn't finish the sentence. How did you ask someone why they hadn't tortured you? How did you articulate the absence of expected cruelty? Dr. Ashford's expression changed, not to pity, to something sadder, deeper, understanding mixed with resignation. You were told I would hurt you, she said. It wasn't a question. Elise nodded. Tears starting, hot, unexpected. 3 years of war, and she'd kept it together. 3 years of amputations and death and choices that haunted her. She'd stayed functional, stayed numb, stayed alive. But this kindness, this professional, clinical, gentle kindness was breaking her in ways that brutality never could have. I took an oath, Dr. Ashford said quietly. She set down the clipboard, gave Elise her full attention. First, do no harm. That oath doesn't have exceptions for nationality. It doesn't say, first, do no harm to Americans. It says, do no harm, period. You're my patient. Whether you're German or American doesn't matter in this room. My job is to make sure you're healthy. Nothing more, nothing less. She paused, then added something that sounded almost angry, not at Elise, at something bigger. War doesn't suspend medicine. It doesn't suspend ethics. It doesn't give doctors permission to become torturers. I don't care what your government told you about us. I don't care what our government says about you. In this room, you're a person who needs medical care, and I'm a doctor who provides it. That's all. That's everything. Elise put her face in her hands and wept, not from relief, not from fear, from the devastating realization that she'd spent 3 years serving a system that had corrupted everything she'd learned in medical school. That had taken the oath she'd sworn the oath to heal, to do no harm, and twisted it into something unrecognizable, something that said German lives mattered and other lives didn't, something that let her walk away from dying prisoners and call it practical, call it necessary, call it war, and she'd believed it. She'd believed it because questioning was dangerous, and because everyone else believed it too, and because the alternative was admitting that she'd been wrong, that she'd let people die for nothing, that she'd violated the most fundamental principle of medicine for a lie. Dr. Ashford didn't try to comfort her, didn't touch her, just waited, let Elise cry, let the breaking happen without interference. When Elise finally looked up, her face wet with tears, Dr. Ashford held out a clean handkerchief, white, pressed. the kind doctors kept in their pockets for moments like this. "What do I do now?" Elise asked. Her voice was raw, broken. Dr. Ashford's expression was gentle but firm. "You heal, you learn, and when this war is over, you go back to Germany and you practice medicine the right way. The way you were supposed to learn it before your government corrupted it. Will anyone listen? Some will, some won't. But that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to be the kind of doctor your patients deserve, all your patients, without exception, nothing more, nothing less." Elise stood. Her legs were unsteady. The room felt smaller. The world felt different. Like gravity had shifted, like up was down and down was up, and everything she had known was suddenly terrifyingly uncertain. She walked to the door, stopped, turned back. "Thank you," she said. The words felt inadequate, insufficient, but they were all she had, Doctor. Ashford nodded, already picking up the chart for the next patient, already moving on to the next examination because there were 6 more German women waiting, 6 more prisoners who'd been taught the same lies, 6 more opportunities to practice medicine the way it was supposed to be practiced. "Send the next one in," she said. Elise walked back to the waiting room. The other nurses looked at her red eyes, at her shaking hands, trying to read what had happened, trying to understand if the torture had begun. Greta grabbed her arm. "What did they do to you?" Elise looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, at the certainty that brutality was coming, at the propaganda still intact, still unbroken, still whispering that Americans were savages. "Nothing," Elise said. The word felt like treason. She did nothing. Just a medical examination. Just medicine. Greta's face twisted. Confusion. Disbelief. "That's impossible." "I know," Elise said. I know. But it had happened. It was real. And the crack that had started with butter and chocolate had just become a chasm. Wide, deep, impossible to bridge. Everything Elise had believed was a lie. Every certainty was false. Every truth was propaganda. And the woman who'd revealed this, who'd shattered Elise's worldview, with nothing more than a professional medical examination and a statement about oaths and ethics, was already examining the next patient, already practicing medicine, already keeping the promise she'd made years ago to do no harm to anyone, without exception, even enemies, even the ones who'd been taught to hate her, even the ones who'd violated that same oath 40 times, 60 times enough times to lose count. Dr. Miriam Ashford kept her oath, and in doing so she destroyed Elise Brandt's world more thoroughly than any torture ever could have. The first weigh-in came 1 week after arrival, standard procedure, all prisoners documented, height, weight, medical status. Elise stood on the scale. The American medic adjusted the weights, 98 pounds. She'd weighed 112 before the war. Before 3 years of field hospitals and turnip soup and choosing who received morphine. The barn at Bastogne had taken the last 14 pounds. "We'll get some weight back on you," the medic said in broken German. He wrote the number on a chart, filed it away. 4 weeks later, another weigh-in, 107 pounds. 9 pounds gained, 8 weeks. 116 pounds, 18 pounds, month 6, May 1945. The war in Europe had ended. Victory in Europe Day had come and gone. Germany had surrendered. The prisoners were waiting for repatriation, waiting to go home to a country that no longer existed in the form they remembered. Elise stepped on the scale. 127 pounds, 29 pounds gained in 6 months, 29 pounds of American food, American abundance, American proof that everything she'd been taught was a lie. Greta was there. She'd gained weight too. They all had. Every German prisoner who'd arrived, malnourished and terrified, and certain they were headed for torture. "We're eating better than we did before capture," Greta said quietly. Her voice held something Elise recognized. Guilt, confusion, the kind that comes from surviving when you expected to die, from thriving when you expected to suffer. My mother weighed 95 pounds when the Red Cross found her, Elise said. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, Frankfurt. Her mother's handwriting shaky but alive. She's in a displaced persons camp. My father died in March. Starvation. Greta didn't respond. What could she say? What words existed for the reality they were living? They'd gained weight while their families starved. They'd eaten butter and chocolate while German citizens ate tree bark and whatever scraps the Allies distributed, because they were prisoners of the savages, because the monsters had fed them, because everything was backwards and upside down and nothing made sense anymore. The Americans didn't break us with cruelty, Elise whispered. They broke us by being human. The camp had a hospital, small, well supplied, run by American medical staff who needed help. German medical prisoners could volunteer. The work was the same: triage, treatment, surgery when necessary. Except now the patients were mixed. German prisoners, American soldiers, displaced persons from a dozen countries. Elise volunteered because sitting idle made her think, made her remember, made her count the deaths she'd caused by walking away. Dr. Isaac Stern was 29, dark hair, tired eyes, hands that moved with the certainty of someone who'd been practicing medicine long enough to trust his instincts. He was treating a German prisoner. Infected leg wound, the kind that required debridement, antibiotics, careful monitoring. Elise assisted. Passed instruments, held retractors, the same work she'd done for 3 years. Except Stern narrated everything, explained his choices, treated her like a colleague, not a prisoner. "You're good at this," he said as they finished. The wound was clean, packed, bandaged. The patient would keep his leg. "Where did you train?" "Frankfurt Medical School, graduated 1941. Stern's hands paused, just for a second, then continued cleaning instruments. "My mother graduated from Frankfurt Medical School," he said. His voice was even, controlled. 1927, before they stopped admitting Jews. The air in the room changed. Elise's hands froze. "She practiced in Munich until 1938, Stern continued, still not looking at Elise, still cleaning instruments with methodical precision. Then we left, England first, then America when war started. She died in 1943. Cancer. Never saw Germany again." "I'm sorry," Elise whispered. The words were inadequate, pathetic. What apology existed for what had been done? "Are you," Stern asked, not cruel, genuinely curious, "sorry for what happened to my mother? For what happened to all of them?" Elise couldn't answer, because the truth was complicated, ugly. She was sorry his mother had been driven out, but she'd also participated in a system that said that was necessary, that said some lives mattered more than others, that said practical choices had to be made. Stern set down the instruments, looked at her directly. "My mother wrote me a letter before she died," he said. "It was smuggled out of the hospital. She knew she was dying, wanted to say goodbye." He paused. "She said, 'When this war ends, Germany will need doctors. Good doctors. Doctors who remember what medicine is supposed to be. If you ever treat German prisoners, Isaac, remember their patients first. Not Germans, not enemies. Patients." His eyes held Elise's. "She made me promise. My mother, a German Jewish doctor who loved medicine more than she hated the people who drove her out, made me promise to treat German prisoners like patients. I let them die," Elise said. The confession came out broken, raw. "Prisoners. When resources were limited, I let them die, because they weren't German, because I prioritized our soldiers, because I thought it was practical." "How many times?" Stern asked. "I don't know, 40, maybe 60. I stopped counting." The silence was crushing. "Then don't do it again," Stern said finally. "That's all you can do. Don't do it again." 3 weeks before repatriation, Dr. Ashford called Elise to her office. Supply inventory, she'd said. Routine work. But when Elise arrived, Ashford's face held something else. Not anger, something sadder. "Can I ask you something personal?" Ashford said. Elise nodded. "In your 3 years as a surgical nurse, did you ever treat prisoners?" The question hung in the air. Elise wanted to lie, wanted to protect herself, but she was tired of lies. "Yes." "How did you treat them?" And Elise told her everything: the Soviet prisoner in Poland who died over 9 hours, the pattern that repeated, the morphine saved for German soldiers, the practical choices, the necessary decisions, the 40 deaths, maybe 60, maybe more. "We didn't torture them," Elise said. Each word was harder than the last. "But we didn't treat them the same as our own. And sometimes when resources were really scarce, prisoners didn't receive treatment at all. We told ourselves it was practical, that we had to prioritize our own people." Dr. Ashford was quiet for a long time. "The oath I took," she said finally, "it says, first do no harm." No, it doesn't say, first do no harm to Americans. It doesn't have a footnote that says, except during wartime or except when resources are scarce. It says, do no harm to everyone, without exception. She leaned forward. "Because if I start making exceptions, if I start deciding some patients matter more than others based on nationality or race or politics, then I'm not a doctor anymore. I'm just a soldier with a medical degree." Elise felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking. Already broken, this was something else. Recognition, the devastating understanding that she'd violated the most fundamental principle of medicine, not because she was forced, because she'd chosen to, because it was easier, because everyone else was doing it, because the propaganda made it seem necessary. "We were told you were the barbarians," Elise whispered, "that you had no ethics, no standards, that you would torture prisoners because you had no honor. I know what you were told, but it was us." Tears were falling now, hot, endless. "We were the ones violating medical ethics. We were the ones letting prisoners die because they weren't German enough. We were the ones who abandoned the oath." Dr. Ashford didn't comfort her. Just let her cry. Let the truth settle. "What do I do now?" Elise asked. "You go back to Germany," Ashford said. "You practice medicine the right way, the way you were supposed to learn it before your government corrupted it. Some people will listen, some won't. But that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to be the kind of doctor your patients deserve. All of them, without exception." November 1945. Elise returned to Frankfurt. The city was rubble. Her medical school was gone. The hospital where she'd trained was destroyed. Her family's apartment building was a crater. She found her mother in a displaced persons camp, 95 pounds, alive. Her father was buried in a mass grave. Starvation. March 1945, 3 months before the war ended. When Elise told her mother about her time in American custody, her mother didn't believe her. "They fed you real meat, real butter. That can't be true." "It is true, Mama." "Then everything we were told was lies. Everything." Elise pulled out the medical chart she'd kept. December 22nd, 1944. Patient Brandt. Elise. Weight 98 pounds. Diagnosis malnutrition, vitamin deficiency, chronic back pain. Treatment: vitamin supplements, increased calories, pain medication. Signed, Dr. Miriam Ashford, MD. "This is proof," Elise said. "Professional, thorough, kind. While Papa was starving, the enemy was feeding me." Her mother stared at the chart for a long time. Then she asked the question Elise had been asking herself for 6 months. How do we rebuild from this? How do we look at ourselves again? Elise thought about Dr. Ashford, about Isaac Stern, about medical ethics that didn't have exceptions for nationality. "We rebuild by doing better," she said, "by refusing to let it happen again." The examination table had been cold, but the doctor's hands had been gentle, and in that gap between what Elise expected and what she received, her entire worldview had shattered. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't cruelty, it's kindness, the kind that forces you to confront every lie you've believed, every choice you've made. Every person you've let die. Dr. Miriam Ashford kept her oath, and in doing so she gave Elise Brandt the chance to rebuild hers, not with torture, not with punishment, but with truth. Simple, devastating, inescapable truth. 2 years later, 1947, the Allied occupation forces established a medical training program in Frankfurt, rebuilding German medicine from the ground up, teaching ethics that had been corrupted, undoing 12 years of propaganda disguised as science. Elise enrolled. She was 29 years old. She'd spent 2 years working in displaced persons camps, treating refugees, treating former enemies, treating everyone the same because Dr. Ashford had shown her how. The first day of class, the instructor walked in, auburn hair, more grey now, white coat, the same posture, the same hands that had examined Elise 3 years earlier in a converted school that smelled of disinfectant and fear. Dr. Miriam Ashford. Their eyes met across the classroom. Recognition, understanding, something that didn't need words. "You came back," Ashford said quietly. "I promised I would." Ashford smiled, tired, genuine. "Then let's teach you the right way." For 48 years, Elise Brandt practiced medicine. Trauma surgery, teaching, she never forgot, never let herself forget. Every patient was the Soviet prisoner she'd let die. Every choice was a chance to keep the oath she'd broken. 1952. Her first surgery as attending physician. A displaced person from the Soviet zone. She treated him like she should have treated that prisoner in Poland. Like a patient. Nothing more, nothing less. 1953. A medical student asked her why she trusted American medical ethics. Elise pulled out a yellowed medical chart. December 22nd, 1944. Dr. Miriam Ashford's signature at the bottom. "This is why," she said, "because someone kept her oath when it would have been easier not to." 1954. A colleague suggested prioritizing German citizens over Turkish immigrant workers when beds were limited. Elise's response was immediate, final. "I won't let it happen again, not once, not ever." 1955. A letter arrived from America. Dr. Isaac Stern retiring after 43 years of medicine. "The students coming out of Germany now understand ethics the way my mother's generation did. Thank you for being part of that change." June 1995. Elise Brandt died at age 77, peacefully, surrounded by former students who'd learned from her that the oath had no exceptions. Her final journal entry, written 1 month before her death, was read at her memorial service. "The propaganda told us Americans were barbarians. I believed every word. What broke me wasn't cruelty, it was kindness. Dr. Ashford kept her oath when treating an enemy. I had broken mine when treating prisoners. First, do no harm. 4 words. No exceptions. The examination table was cold, but the doctor's hands were gentle. And in that gap between what I expected and what I received, my entire world view shattered." 3 months after Elise's death, a student cleaning her office found an unsealed envelope, dated May 1995. Never sent. The letter inside was addressed to Dr. Miriam Ashford, Maryland, United States. "Dear Dr. Ashford, I don't know if you're alive, if this will reach you, but I need you to know I weighed 98 pounds when you examined me. 6 months later, 127 pounds. Every pound was proof I was wrong. You gave me vitamins and calories. My government gave me lies. You kept your oath. I broke mine 40 times, maybe 60. I let prisoners die. I've spent 50 years trying to make up for it. I don't know if I have. But because of you, I taught 300 doctors, and everyone knows the oath has no exceptions. Thank you for showing me what I should have been." Elise Brandt. The student sent the letter. It was returned 3 weeks later. Addressee deceased. Dr. Miriam Ashford died April 1995, age 95. Natural causes. Elise never knew if her thanks reached the woman who'd changed everything. Never knew that they'd died 2 months apart. Never knew that the doctor who'd kept her oath and the nurse who'd broken hers had both in the end found peace. 2 medical professionals, 2 nations, 2 sides of a war neither had wanted. One kept her oath when it was hardest. One spent 50 years rebuilding the oath she'd broken, and in the space between cruelty expected and kindness received, the world changed. One examination at a time, one patient at a time, one choice at a time, the examination table was cold. But the doctor's hands were gentle, and sometimes that's enough to shatter everything, and sometimes from the shattering, something better can be built.